Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Gaik Khoo, and I'm the director of the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute. And tonight we're very pleased to host a timely panel on the upcoming Malaysian general elections. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the format, and then I'll hand over the mic to my colleague, Professor William Case, to introduce our speakers and to moderate the discussion. So we have three speakers with us tonight. They'll take about 10 to 15 minutes each to present. And then of course, we'll leave a lot of time for questions from the floor. And you can either type in the chat box at the bottom if you look under more, or you can kind of, you can speak up and you can unmute your button to do that, or raise your hand under reactions, and I'll call, Bill will call on you. All right, so let me, without further ado, let me hand the mic over to my colleague, Professor William Case. Bill is professor and the head of the School of Politics, History, and International Relations in our university. So, Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Gaik. Welcome everyone. You can hear me, right? This is okay. All right. So yes, Gaik is quite right. I'm William Case from the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and let me just say that I'm very pleased to be asked to moderate the seminar tonight. This is an important one. The title of the seminar is "Dreams and Realities in GE15: What Matters and Why." That's an intriguing title. I want to hear more about the dreams. So I'm looking forward to that. And as mentioned, the seminar has been organized by the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute. Let me give another nod of appreciation to the Institute's director, Dr. Cheng. There have been a lot of seminars this week and last week, but this one promises to stand out because you know why? Voting begins in less than 60 hours time. So it starts very soon, and that may mean that this seminar has the last word. So this could be a crucial one. So to give us the last word, we have three experts with us tonight. Dr. Vilashini Somiah, who is an anthropologist from Sabah, and Professor Azizuddin Mohd Sani, who is a political scientist who comes to us from Kedah. And finally, Dr. Bridget Welsh, who is an election specialist and a columnist and a consultant, and she makes her home here in Malaya. Okay, we've only been given 90 minutes, and much of that time is already, some of the time's already passed. So I'm not going to say too much here at the outset, just a quick opening remark, and it's this. This election, of course, is Malaysia's 15th general elections, its independence. And this particular election is like no other election in this country's political history. So it's highly competitive, it's very uncertain, and almost to the point of fragmentation. You can see, though, that there's been a kind of cycling here. It was Barisan, that seemed first to take the lead, and then was overtaken by Perikatan. And here there's a last-minute surge, it seems, by Pakatan. But, there are over almost 1,000 candidates who are running in this contest, so it's really quite unpredictable. But we do know this, that when the election is over, the landscape looks like it's still going to be very unsettled. So it looks like Malaysia is going to have to go into extra innings. So to shed some light on this very suspenseful electoral event, I'll turn you over now to our speakers. As you've heard, the format is this: 15 minutes for each of you, 15 minutes tops, and that should leave us 30 minutes or so for questions. Okay, so I think our first speaker is Dr. Vilashini Somiah. Am I right? She's first on the list. And so just a few words of introduction. She's an anthropologist. Again, she comes to us from Sabah. She is a senior lecturer in the Gender Studies program at University of Malaya, an even older institution than Nottingham, Malaysia. She's published 2 books in the last 2 years, immensely productive. Sabah From the Ground, which was published last year, 2021, a study of the 2020 election in that state, and Irregular Migrants in the Sea, which was published this year, also set in Sabah. So with that, let me begin and ask Dr. Vilashini to tell us something about GE15 here in 2022.
Thank you very much for that, Prof. Case. I also want to give my thanks to University of Nottingham, Dr. Gaik. It's an honor to speak together with Dr. Bridget Welsh and also Prof. Aziz. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Just allow me a second to sort of share my slides, yeah, really quickly, because we're all kind of addicted to slides, I think, and not in the best way possible. Here we go. Give me a second. Can I please get a confirmation that everybody can see this?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for taking some time out of your evening. Very, very hot evenings these days, leading up to GE15. Just to hear from the three of us about really what we think or what we see and what we feel that's going on from the ground. As Professor William Case has so rightly pointed out, I am Sabahan, and my area of focus has always been on Sabah or the Greater Borneo. I work primarily with migrant groups and also indigenous groups, and I try to sort of see overlapping and also distinct issues that both communities essentially experience. Sabah is one of those places that I think is just incredibly, incredibly fascinating, especially when it comes to any elections, really. It has a long history of always doing sometimes the unthinkable, and in other times the most predictable. And because of that, I think it would be good for me, an anthropologist, not a political scientist, to sort of give us an idea of what's really happening from the ground. However, I just kind of want to put it out there that I work in what we Borneans call Malaya, and unfortunately, I don't get to have as much time as I can back home. A lot of my information is informed by previous networks that I've, collected and gained and grown in the last decade or so. But I think those snapshots, and as I prepare to head home to Sabah to cast my vote, which is a must, here are some of the things that are happening, or at least some snapshots from the ground that I think are sort of important for us to pay attention to as we unpack what's going on in GE15 today. So I just want to set the stage for everybody. There are a couple of things that I need to point out. There's a lot of, I would say, myths that are built about Sabah in relation to politics. Since they agreed to participate in what we call Malaysia today, right, in the building of the country. And in the position that I think Sabah and Sabahans have been placed in is that being sort of constantly neglected and forgotten and left behind in the larger political narrative of the country, is that we do anything for money. But there are a couple of things I kind of want to point out very clearly as we move along this presentation, and that Sabah is more than just about money. Politics, and this also encompasses the general elections or state elections or what have you, is really also about identity, a sense of loyalty, and really survival of a people, and survival on many levels as well, right? Survival of a culture, survival of political ideologies, and really physical and economic survival. And the secondly is that there's this thing whenever I speak to Sabahans in relation to politics, which is try everything and anything but trust no one. And I'll unpack this as we move along. So just a quick overview on the sort of political setup in G15. I always feel that it's important to start off this way simply because for anybody who pays attention to Malaysian politics by and large, what you're paying attention to is peninsular politics. And so when they try to sort of shift their understanding towards things that are happening in both Sabah and Sarawak. I'm always told that it's really complicated, but it isn't complicated. It's just, you know, sort of a different way of looking at the sort of political landscape. So of what we know, Barisan Nasional is one major bloc that is certainly sort of competing at this point. Now, I am going to sort of point out the obvious smaller parties under the coalitions, but also I think important here is to inform you of where it is that Sabah is wedged in and what parties are participating in these major coalitions as well. So under Barisan Nasional, of course, you know, UMNO and MCA and MIC, but specific to Sabah, we are also looking at Parti Bersatu Rakyat Sabah PBRS, okay? Just stay with me, you'll sort of get the picture in a while. Also, what I call, in the midst of a lover's spat really, is Perikatan Nasional, right? And Perikatan Nasional is sort of summed up by Bersatu PAS Gerakan, but in Sabah, they have Parti Solidarity Tanah Airku, which is STAR, and SAPP, which is the Sabah Progressive Party. Over on the other side, really hoping to gain a lot of momentum on the ground is Pakatan Harapan. And Pakatan Harapan also building a lot of dreams and trying to gain a lot of momentum on the ground. As I said, with PKR, some spots in which where, you know, sort of Muda comes in. But officially in Sabah, PH is represented in the most parts, not all the time, by UPCO, the United Progressive Kinabalu Organization. And lastly, there is the famous Warisan, that's based in Sabah. You know, it's a rebranding of the Heritage Party of long ago. It does also have affiliations with Muda, and it's trying to sort of spread its wing. It's doing the opposite of what, you know, the BNPH and PN coalition are doing. They are trying to spread its Sabah political ideology into the peninsula of Malaysia. However, there is a massive contradiction that I feel everybody has to consider, which is while BN and PN are rivals in the peninsula, strangely and interestingly, they are allies in Sabah. So under this local coalition, which they call Gabungan Rakyat Sabah, GRS, you do see PBS, Bersatu Sabah, SAPP STAR, and another party called USNO, and they are in close coalition. They form the state government together with BN PAS, also Parti Kesejahteraan Demokratik Malaysia Masyarakat KDM, which is a really, I suppose, it's a good pun because KDM also represents or also means locally Kadazan Dusun Murut, and KDM, the party, is meant to sort of represent the interests of the KDM people. And lastly, Parti Cinta Sabah, PCS. So, you know, ultimately, what does Sabah want? What does Sabah need, right? And they've wanted and needed the same thing they've wanted and needed for decades now. The truth is, Sabah has a long list of unfinished business, or what they call locally hutang tertunggak, right? Unpaid dues. And a lot of it, I think, stemming from the Malaysia Agreement 1963 that really talks about elevating both Sabah and Sarawak to equal partners, right? You know, these equal territories. You're not states, you're like major contributors to this huge idea, which is forming the sovereign nation that is Malaysia. And I think the trickle-down effect is that ME 63 does bleed into larger issues that are happening in Sabah, right? We've got a massive migration crisis in the state, an area that I've worked on for many, many years. And this also leads to this huge issue of citizenship. And I didn't put it in here, partially because I was careless. But, you know, this conversation about irregular migration and citizenship, or illegal migrants, really does stem from this other major issue, which is Project IC, allegedly spearheaded by previous Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. And then, you know, other things that they really want is autonomy over border control, you know, better development and economic opportunities for people. And, you know, Sabah is home to 8 out of 10 of the poorest districts in the country still. So these opportunities, development and economic opportunities, are greatly needed, and they're greatly needed to be, you know, offered in a very sustainable manner. We also cannot forget the issue of the loss of indigenous rights. And, you know, a thing that sort of reoccurs every time there's a major election, equal consideration for major federal positions of maybe PM, maybe that's dreaming too high, but certainly Deputy Prime Minister. So, you know, these are some of the things in which, you know, it really is about representation and acknowledgement of the neglect and the under-attention that Sabah has experienced in the face of sort of becoming a member of Malaysia. So the big question is, gearing up for GE15, are parties addressing these concerns for Sabahans? So let's take a look at the PH manifesto, and I'm just going to use the PH manifesto in place of everything, because I think Warisan has also sort of made a list of certain things in a different way. But if we're looking at parties that are not necessarily entirely native to Sabah, right? What will Sabahans and of course our cousins next door, Sarawakians, gain? So these are just a list of, you know, with the help of Malaysia Kini's GE helper, and also in reading some of the manifestos that have been put up. There are approximately 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 major points that include Sabah. And this would be something that I personally would love to have: postal voting rights as a Sabahan diaspora living in Kuala Lumpur, right? Fixed prices for all of us who want to go home, especially if you're a student, or, you know, you are a daily wage earner, or, you know, you just barely make ends meet. It's also an issue about land grants. It's about, you know, establishing a recognized native justice justice department through the native courts. PH is also talking about considering 2 deputy prime ministers from both Sabah and Sarawak. They are talking about some autonomy over Sabah electricity, restoring the power of the TYT, the Tun Yang Terutama, because we don't have, they're sort of like local kings, right? And talking about more higher education institutions in Sabah and Sarawak, so that you can ensure that Sabahans and Sarawakians are competitive. It may not be the most extensive manifesto, but it's certainly a good start. But by comparison, this is what BN and PN's manifesto for Sabah and Sarawak look like combined, right? They are talking about, like PH, the establishment of new universities in both Sabah and Sarawak. And oddly enough, reviving a ferry service that connects Malaya to Sabah and Sarawak. So, you know, certainly these jarring differences really informs us of the way in which I think some of the manifestos, or whoever it is who's writing the manifestos for BN and PN, may not have really taken into consideration the urgent needs for a lot of these things. So in answering, you know, I understand Professor William Case is eager to hear some of the dreams that are coming out of people on the ground. Unfortunately, a lot of the dreams are actually not so much there. I think it's a lot of fears for potential nightmare growth, right? And I put it as hopes and concerns, really. And some of these are really old. First of all, it really is about money. And while I said it's not only about that, it still is to a certain extent, right? A part of it really is about money. Money politics really continues to be practiced. Sabah, of course, as I've explained, really suffering from issues of underdevelopment and neglect. And for especially people living in the interiors and semi-urban constituencies, getting these handouts are actually, you know, something that is seen as a seasonal practice, right? And not everything just comes in the form of cash handouts. They can come in the form of food, or, you know, Sabah has a really huge problem with getting clean water into many villages, so water tanks, schools, and sometimes, you know, public hospitals are in a state of decay. So building materials for those, public amenities and even homes are necessary. And in some communities, giving of alcohol is a really big thing. right? And this is on top of your cash subsidies and on top of, you know, future promised subsidies that will come in the form of, help for farmers or fishermen or what have you, or local entrepreneurs. And on top of that, you know, recently my mother's family home in Nottingham suffered a massive flood, like a horrible flood. And these floods that have been happening also in other parts of the country have really exacerbated these expectations. And so I quote a very a funny but, you know, important line that I would hear from Sabahans, right? Ngap dulu undi nanti cerita, right? Eat whatever you want first, and then we'll talk about the votes later. And I think this is really a practice of survival. They know that the gravy train is coming, and these expectations are that I deserve it. You don't give anything to us as Sabahans as much as you would somebody in Malaya. So, you know, I'm just going to take it first. Ethics be damned, right? Because this is about, you paying your dues. You need my votes, and that I will think about the vote a little later on. This correlates to a point that I will make a little later again. The second issue is actually really about female voters, right? At the moment, only 21 out of 119 Sabahan candidates are women. And just to inform you, the two largest representation of women come from Warisan. They've got 6 candidates, I believe, and Pakatan Harapan as a coalition has 7. Every other party or coalition is fielding 1 or 2, depending on one of those variations. While a lot of people may say that's incredibly low, unfortunately, this does reflect the national average of female candidates in the GE15 currently. There's only about 127 of 900 some candidates are women. So that's at 13%. So Sabah is fielding just a little bit higher, just by a smidge compared to the national average. But interestingly, you do find that more and more urban Sabahans, those living in Kota Kinabalu, even in places like Sandakan, are were hoping to see more women being fielded in GE15, which really wasn't the case. So this takes us to this other issue, right? I mean, who do you vote for at this point? And what are the thoughts about going in to vote? For areas that have been Warisan and UMNO strongholds, and I'm using sort of UMNO and Warisan simply because prior to Warisan taking over as state, as a state government, forming the state government, Sabah has been a BN or an UMNO stronghold for years, decades even, right? Pegging the title fixed deposit for Warisan National. And so when it comes to thinking about voting in Warisan, that was only in for up until a month or 2 after the Sheraton move, is that, what developments have come in, or what aids have come in for assistance for local Sabahans living in these areas. Interestingly, this is sort of goes hand in hand with this narrative that there is some growing support for Pakatan Harapan, especially places where I think the AP is essentially standing. In that conversation of deciding whether to trade previous votes for Warisan, for example, particularly raises the question of, would trading Warisan for a vote for Pakatan Harapan be a betrayal of local loyalty, simply because this entire idea of the Borneo bloc narrative exists, right? On the ground, for people who really buy into this idea, is the belief that if you vote in state parties or local parties or domestic parties, then there is a possibility of becoming kingmakers. And there is always that sort of hang up with that fantasy making. Can we be kingmakers and sort of determine how it is we can make demands at the end of the GE15 election rounds? But of course, most importantly, and this comes up again and again, is that the truth is a lot of people are still not necessarily decided just yet, right? There are the number of people who are undecided about how to vote or who to vote for before they enter the ballot room is really in concerns with this issue of frogging. Now, Sabah unlike, I guess, on a federal level, has not actually passed the anti-hopping bill, and really only hopes to do so once GE15 is over, allegedly somewhere in late November. But even with that, I think there is a lack of trust or a sense of disillusionment that actually exists. A person that I spoke to recently said, I feel incredibly jaded, right? Because a local term here is tatap juga dorang berkatak nanti, right? They'll continue to be frogs, right? And this idea of frogging, for those of you who don't know, goes back to this phenomenon of political candidates who've already been voted into power, jumping from one political alliance to another, right? On top of frogging is this idea that there's ongoing fighting or bergaduh berhabis, right? They're just ongoing, they're just not ending the fight or infighting or, you know, just clashes between personalities. So the idea here is that the potential for aggressive realignment of newer coalitions post GE15 means if you vote, it wouldn't really matter. And when a candidate changes allegiances or alliances, that would also have concerns with whether their manifestos can be fulfilled. Here's the last one, and I'm kind of hoping to end on a slightly lighter note, is that it really is about where youth participation sort of comes in. At this point, there are the grassroots youth movement is very strong, and we do see a lot of local CSOs and NGOs. There are civil society groups that are completely dedicated to the political education of youth. Undi Sabah is a very good example, and all their affiliates. But there are also NGOs and CSOs that did not start off as sort of pro-youth social engagement groups that have also conducted outreach and education of how new voters should really function and vote and think about things throughout Sabah, right? What's interesting is that many, I think, young voters in the interiors do talk about how it is that their families can influence or might have some influence in the way they vote. And family influence essentially means, you know, votes that are going to, that might come from BN strongholds or something of that sort. But we also do find that a lot of young people are sort of thinking outwardly about whether they want to follow these recommendations, so to speak. And social media really helps them sort of interact with these larger discussions that are happening for their own circle. So I think it is giving us a sense of growing maturity among Sabahan voters, spearheaded by much younger voters. I think the Gen Z and the younger millennials. I'm known as a geriatric millennial, apparently, for being born in the early end of the 80s. So I don't think I count, but certainly I think with that, we do see a potential for a different kind of change coming to Sabah, if not in GE15, then certainly in the coming GE16. As far as it may seem at this point, as right before we head for GE15, one election to another is never really that far away, right? So that's it. That's all I have to say. Really, it's just, you know, capturing some ideas and some narratives. I'm really open to sort of having this discussion with everybody a little later. As we say, ba terima kasih ya, and kotuhuadan. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, okay, thank you very much for that. We're a little over time, but I guess I allowed that. Rural weightage, right? So that makes us a little bit behind, but not too bad. Let's go to our next speaker then. We'll save all the questions for the end. Isn't that the format? Okay, so our second speaker, Professor Dr. Azizuddin Sani, who specializes, sort of like I do, in comparative politics and international relations. So it's a pleasure to meet you. Dr. Azizuddin is a professor in the School of International Studies and the College of Law. Right, so that's something I don't do. That's quite novel. And he's at the University of Malaysia, UUM. And he too has published a book this year, the very timely volume entitled "The Prospect of Electoral Reforms in Malaysia." Okay, so let me turn it over to Aziz, if I may, and so the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Case, for your brief introduction about me. And also, thank you very much for Nottingham University for inviting me for this session, which is, I think, very interesting, very timely, that we discuss something which is, I think, we'll go in depth about relation in Malaysia. And to my fellow panelists as well, Bridget and also Vilashini. So, and I also hoping that I can also hear your, I already hear Vilashini's views, then I think I hope I can hear also Bridget's view about probably what's the outcome for this coming election. Okay, my topic, basically, I will discuss about Kedah, what's going to happen in Kedah when it comes to this coming elections. And I think I will touch slightly at the end about the situation if we're going to have hung parliament and how the president case in Kedah and also Perak can help us to understand what's going to happen if that's the situations in this coming election. So okay, yeah, I think as I mentioned by Bridget earlier, during when we have an earlier discussion, that I'm from Perak. So I'm originally from Perak. I'm still loyal to Perak. So I'm Perakian. I will vote in Gopeng, just a neighboring constituency to Tambun, so very close to Tambun. And when it comes to football, I think I will always support Perak Football Club. Even though I'm married to Kedahan, lived in Kedah for 22 years, and my children are born in Kedah. So partly, I think also I'm Kedahan. So it's a fusion between Kedah and also Perak. So just to say that I'm living here for 22 years, then probably you can probably get some knowledge and understanding about what's happened in Kedah and what to expect when it comes to election. First of all, I think I'm sorry I didn't prepare any slides, but I just give you my some of my findings in my research in Kedah. Probably you can get some ideas about the situation in Kedah. So I think basically what we understand about Kedah, Kedah is what we call is a swing state, because we can see it always changed. I think in 2008, previously it's always a Barisan Nasional forces in Kedah, and so Tun Mahathir is from here, and many also strong leader of Kedah like Sanusi Junid. Actually, you can see that BN always winning Kedah until in 2008 when suddenly it collapsed. Meaning that the Pakatan Rakyat back then took over, and somehow in 2013 is back under Barisan Nasional led by Mukris, who's now the president of Pejuang. So then until in the last election, you can see that Pakatan Harapan managed to win Kedah until I think in 2020 when there's a change of government, then suddenly PAS took over. So it's always known to be a swing state, and that's why it makes Kedah I think very interesting. And now as we know that in Kedah there are four, meaning that 4 coalitions which is contesting very, I think, aggressively in order to win Kedah. As we know that Barisan Nasionals contesting in all 15 constituency, parliamentary constituency in Kedah, and together also Pakatan Harapan and Perikatan Nasional led by PAS basically, and I think GTA, Gabungan Tanah Air, led by Tun Mahathir. They I think are contesting about 13 seats in Kedah. But another thing which is very interesting is Warisan also contesting in Kedah, with only 5 seats. So okay, the situation that we can understand about Kedah is clearly out of we have about 1.5 million voters in Kedah, and it's clearly is up for grab for everybody actually, because in order to see the patterns of voting, I think we need to divide into urban, suburban, and also rural area in Kedah. So because Pakatan Harapan, for example, is very strong in the urban area, and why it is strong because it got the support from the Malay, the urban Malay, and also outside voters who came back to vote, and also at the same time the non-Malay. So based on my research in Kedah recently, I can see the pattern almost similar to what happened in the last election, meaning that the formula that I use actually, if the constituency have about 20% of the non-Malay, meaning that there's a possibility of Pakatan Harapan to win in Kedah. So I think you can check, constituency like Pulim Bandar Baru, Alustar, Sungai Petani, Merbok, and Padang Serai, for example, they have about more than 30% of the non-Malay that in those areas. I mean, there's a possibility of Pakatan Harapan to win in those areas. But in the rural area, actually, is a better between actually basically Barisan Nasional and PAS, or Perikatan Nasional, because basically based on my observation, I think I can see Perikatan Nasional actually is stronger, in the rural area, but somehow, what interesting about PAS, this is also the same pattern that I observed in the previous election. Even though they are very strong in areas such as Jelun, Padang Terap, Baling, but when it comes to voting, they sometimes give to the candidates rather than party. Meaning that in terms of voting, they vote for candidate rather than parties. So meaning that they also can vote for candidates from a different party, not from their own party. So that's why in the survey, you can see that, PAS can win in those areas. But I suspect, when it comes to voting, probably there might be a slight change, in terms of, voting. Meaning that they can vote for either Barisan Nasional candidates or Pejuang candidates, and so on. So the pattern you can see almost, in Langkawi, so you can see that some, in my engagement, PAS member seems that they also want to give support to Tun Mahathir, and okay, why this kind of situation happens? Because if you read my article published by Routledge, authored by Terence Gomez, with regard to last election, it's always a battle between parties versus personalities in Kedah, because somehow in Kedah we have more prominent personalities like Tun Mahathir, Mukres, and now from Perikatan Nasional we have Sanusi, the chief minister. So meaning that the tendency of the voters will vote for these people, rather than their own party or parties that they choose. And at the same time, so we have we call it not only national figures but also local figures, which I think very dominant in certain areas. For example, like Dr. Amaruddin, for example, Pampasu, very prominent local figure. Khoo Rahman, another one, local leader from Perikatan Nasional, and Saifuddin Nasution, I think, is one also a prominent figure. And so on. So in this case, voters will vote for this personality rather than political party. And because of that, I think you can see that probably the patterns of voting almost similar to last generation. But that I think it is also remain to be seen. Whether suddenly this, I'm also not sure whether this coming election is going to change back to pattern of voting for parties or rather than personality. But I think based on my engagement by the local people, is going to be similar like the last generation, meaning that they will vote for personalities rather than parties. So that makes very interesting. That's why when it comes to thinking about who's going to win in certain constituencies, I can say that even the Pejuang, for example, they are not really strong. It's a very new party and doesn't have enough missionaries, even grassroots, support, but because of the respect of the people to Tun Mahathir and also Mukhris as a 2 times Menteri Besar or Chief Minister, so there's a possibility, a highly possibility that they will win in their own constituencies. Similarly, in the case of, for example, like Datuk Mahathir Khalid, who from Barisan Nasional contesting in Padang Terap, even though right now, if based on my observation, actually Datuk Mahathir Khalid actually never leave his constituency because he's too worried that he might lose in this coming election. But when thinking about past, in the way of supporting personalities, and they used also to support him to win in the last generation, and he also can see that very close to the Prime Minister Dr. Sri Ismail Sabri. That's why I was thinking that probably he still has a good chance to win in this election. But I'm not sure about Aziz Rahim, who are so very prominent personalities in Bali. He's from a different faction, from the Zahid faction, which I think is not really likable to past supporter. That's why I'm not sure whether this time around they will give him to win Bali. Instead of him, probably the past supporter will support candidates from Perikatan Nasional. So in this context, you can see that is the pattern of voting is very interestingly unique compared to probably other states that I observed. For example, like in the case of Perak. And okay, another aspect which I think I want to touch about in looking in the areas like suburban areas like Pokok Sena, for example, Jerai, for example. So this area are predominantly Malay, but in the case of Pokok Sena, they has one constituency which is Derga, which is predominantly actually non-Malay as a voter over there, and in that case, I think it's going to be a battle between the Pakatan Harapan candidates Mahfuz with the chief of Majlis Ulama, the Muslim scholars of past, who are also contesting in Pokok Sena. In this context, I think is a open battle between all parties to win in the suburban area, because it's a very we have significant number of people who live in urban area, but also significant number of people who live in a rural area, which is I think the sentiment is a bit different, which is according to what I mentioned earlier, which is when it comes to urban area, you can see that the fight always between Barisan Nasional and also Pakatan Harapan, but in the rural area more about Barisan Nasional with PAS. So the sentiment is still there, but it's mixed a bit in the suburban area. The only thing is about Jerai, a bit interesting because DAP contesting there, and it create a huge tussle between members of Pakatan Harapan, particularly DAP and also Amanah, because leaders of Amanah who being sacked, Fakhur Razi decided saying that DAP should not contest there because this area is belong to Amanah, and because 80% of the population voters there, actually Malay, is difficult for DAP to win this area. So I think in a way there's a good argument, a good reason for not reading, DAP candidates over there. But I think there's also a big chance for DAP to see whether how big support among the Malay to the party in this area. But of course, this area is is an open battle as well, because PAS won Jerai in the last election with a very small margin majority. And the second place is Barisan Nasional, and the third place is actually Pakatan Harapan. But I'm not sure who's going to win this area, but you can see it's also contested by the head of UMNO, Kedah UMNO right now, Jamil Baharo. So if he can employ a good strategy, I think Barisan Nasional actually can capture this area. But saying what happened to Barisan Nasional right now, when they have a internal problem in fighting between leaders, from different factions, if sabotage among within the parties happen, then I think I don't think Jerai can be can be won by Barisan Nasional. So meaning that PAS still have a good chance to win. So in overall, I think Kedah is I think very interesting state to see. But in terms of who's going to win, I think it's going to be divided to all four coalitions. I think most of the seats from mostly urban area will Pakatan have a good chance to win. But I think in rural area it will be divided between Barisan Nasional and PAS. But certain area which I think Juan has a good chance to win. For example, like Langkawi, Jorlon, and also Kubang Pasu. Okay, what interesting. That's all about Kedah. And I want to jump a little bit about the national situation right now. Because all debates, all I think research been done, all findings that we can see that probably there's going to be hung parliament. So if hung parliament happen, I think the Kedah and Perak situation can be applied. Okay, what I'm saying, what I meant by this actually, if you look into the last general election, okay, in Perak, for example, when Pakatan Harapan, okay, I have no time left. What I can summarize from this actually, probably I can explain later that it depends on the who get the biggest number, of parliamentary seats. That party actually can decide to form a government, and then from there, I think if Pakatan, for example, has the biggest number, then they probably can decide. But it also depends on who wants to join that. So okay, I'll leave you there. Probably later on we can discuss further about this, interesting topic. So back to you, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Aziz. I'll make sure you get some questions so that you can. Okay, great. Okay, our final speaker then is Dr. Bridget Welsh, who's an old friend. It's true. I've known Bridget for about 30 years, and many of you know her too. So I don't need to say very much. Just a few words of introduction. Bridget is a research associate at the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute, right? The host, the sponsor of this seminar. She's a columnist, a commentator, an analyst, and a consultant of political risk. She is a writer of many articles and books on Malaysia and much more. So there's a lot of comparative work and investigation throughout the Southeast Asian region. So that's great. And I think what's particularly interesting about Bridget's work on Malaysia is that she invites us to look beyond just the usual variables. We look at the elites and race and religion and urban and rural location. Those things matter, to be sure, but Bridget always makes sure that we enlarge the perspective and look at new things like gender, and especially socioeconomic class, generational membership. And so if you've been reading her columns in Malaysia Kini, there's a series of 4 or 5 of them, I think so far, and all of which, take a new line and again, take a new perspective. So that's been quite interesting. So let me turn the floor over to Dr. Bridget Welsh now, my old friend, and you've got 15 minutes.
Thank you very much.
No friendship there. No at a time.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Bill, for the very kind introduction. And thank you, Gaik, for all your organization with this seminar. I have prepared slides and I'm going to pull out a few of them. But I want to sort of begin by thanking both Villa and Aziz for a very rich conversation about 2 of the very frontline areas that aren't really talked about, that I think really draw attention to the things that are happening on the ground. And I think that, the tendency is to focus on the big names in the big picture, things around Kuala Lumpur and Selangor, as opposed to in the periphery areas where really we have intensive battlegrounds taking place. And because this election is going to be so close in terms of the numbers, these areas, I think, rightly need to get more attention. But let me turn quickly to my slides and just to talk about some bigger pictures. And I'm watching the time, Bill. So let me sort of keep that in mind. Can you see everything? Is this fine? Can you see? Can you see?
Yes, yes.
Good, thanks. Okay. Look, I think we all know this, right? This is we're 3 days from voting, but I think it's useful to talk about how this election is different. You know, I think one of the things that I'm seeing on the ground that I want to highlight, and there's just 2 points from this slide I want to push. Malaysians are willing to take risks now more than ever before. They're willing to put in new people. Whether or not that's Perkatan Nasional or whether or not that's Pakatan Harapan, and this is across the country. This is a very different perspective than what existed 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. There is this sense of, well, we can always kick them out in that context. The second thing is that there is a lot more cynicism, or what we could say, reality among the voters, right? They know that there's a lot of anti-politician sentiment, you know, that I really hear across communities. And so in a sense that kind of reception the politicians have gotten before, that they were fawned over, they were heroes, that doesn't quite exist to the same degree this particular time. And it's interesting, candidate Jintra or party workers across the country, they talk about how hard this election is because they have to fight for the votes because they're not given that same level of, you know, respect that they've gotten, because the voters are saying, hey, wait a minute, you better listen to me. This is my time. I'm going to make it. I'm going to make it happen. Now, you know, we've got a lot of big pictures, things happening in Malaysia right now, besides what's happening in the electorate. You know, we have a situation where we've got these leaders of the past, personality, dynamics, and this is really going to be their last election. I think it's going to be Anwar, Mahathir, Zahid, Muhyiddin Yassin's all last election. And what we're seeing, interestingly enough, are these new leaders that are coming, that are, many of them are running for more candidates, more seats than imagined. I think there is a generational leadership taking place, even if the attention is on the old men. And I think the campaign started very slowly. And it's really in this last week that we've seen kind of real big changes that are starting to take place. Initially, you know, UMNO went into this election with confidence, and rightly so, and they managed to mess it up. And then Perkatan Nasional basically gained a lot of traction, and now they've managed to mess that up. And then Pakatan Harapan has gained some traction, although not in everywhere. And the question is whether or not they'll mess it up. But we will see how these things play out in the last few days. Now, the second sort of big issue I want to talk to you about is really how important this election is. You know, people, they talk all about just these individuals in the news. You know, these things are, there's this focus on personality and persona because reporters find it easy to talk about these things. But that's not really what this election is about. This election is about some very big issues. And many of these are not getting the attention that they deserve. Number one, I think we're going to see whoever comes in is going to make a decision to whether or not political reforms in this country are going to move forward or not. And these are big things: changes to the parliament, changes to the election commission, creating a system where actually the postal ballots arrive on time. Come on, all right? A situation where the EC is seen to be more professional in the way that it is engaging for things, and of course the rule of law. And this is extremely important for Malaysia's international reputation. You know, I think one of the things that I think UMNO doesn't fully realize, that having their prime minister candidate de facto be a man with 87 charges of corruption doesn't help the country. It just doesn't, please, in that circumstances. Another issue that has emerged in this extremely racialized campaign, there's been tremendous hate speech in this campaign, more so than I would argue than previous elections, has been the issues of inclusion for non-Malays and inclusion for Sarawak and Sabah. And I think these issues are quite important because some coalitions don't have any meaningful non-Malay representation. And I think these, and we can see that this campaign has become racialized because the parties don't want to up their game to talk about policies or even debate it. So the consequence has been that they turn back to these old ways of evoking emotional responses, be it about DAP and Jirai, as Aziz was talking about, or issues of statements that are being made. So this is going to be a very important issue about what type of Malaysia. Bill asked me earlier, what about the dreams? I mean, there are people who have dreams about this country that are very different, about where they see the country, of what it means to be Malaysian. The economy is the most important issue everyone talks about on the ground. Whether or not you're in a car with a Grab driver who's looking at his mortgage payment, or whether or not I was speaking to a woman in an Indian village today in Kuala Selangor, who was basically talking about how she can't make her living, and is basically moved from eating to eating only one meal a day for herself, so that she can have her family eat too. These are realities that people are experiencing on the ground. And the talk about how Malaysia's economy is going to grow has been very minimal. And I'm going to have a few slides on this. And it will affect the type of economy and economic transformation the country has, aka whether or not it will be able to move out of a contract patronage system. If there's a compromise hung parliament, which I expect there will be, the implication will be that there may be 241 additional appointments to basically appease the different actors in a cabinet of 70. These types of things are big questions in terms of where money is being allocated in that process. Competent governance. Do you want people who know how to do things or not? Many of these candidates are not competent politicians. And I think, I was struck, I was just earlier today in Sungai Besar where Jamal Yunus is running, the man who is quite a character. And in his, is he the type of person that you want in parliament? If you want entertainment, perhaps, I'm worrying entertainment, but if you want competent governance, it's another question. And so we can ask that for across the different parties, right? And about how many people have put people who know how to do things in that job, as opposed to being party loyalists. And of course, this is the first election that when nobody can really answer the question, who will be the next prime minister of Malaysia? And it's only one coalition that has consistency on who that prime minister candidate should be, and that is Anwar Ibrahim and Pakatan Harapan. Even in PN, there are people who feel it could be Hadi. So we see a situation where we have these big sets of questions that are going on. And I'm going to quickly look at time, Bill, to make sure I'm not moving over. All right, I'm getting close. Now, we know what's going on. There's a power struggle among leaders. There's a Malay power struggle, which everyone can see in states like Kedah, in northern Selangor, in Pahang. These are places in Perak. These are places where the struggle about where the vote of the Malay community is going to go. I think BN and PN are in a battle for identity of who will control and who will speak for the Malay community. And it is fascinating to watch the intensity of that battle in that regard compared to the past. Who would have ever thought that PN would have been able to take so much vote from young people and be able to even emerge as a national coalition, a national contender? This is a profoundly transformative force where you have a third coalition that has become a player on the national stage in a short campaign period. It may not be as strong as BN. BN may make a last minute surge, but it is interesting to see that we have a dynamic that has shifted, and it shifted because some of the reasons I spoke about earlier, a changed electorate, risk-taking, a sense of wanting to, unhappiness with Barisan Nasional's leadership. I was struck in a conversation I had with a woman who's an immigration officer, and we were talking about individuals in elections. And I didn't even mention this man's name, and she just said, Zahid Hamid is a bully. This is from someone who works for the government, who is, and this is why I tell you these little stories is to give a picture of how people are seeing things very differently. You would have never have heard this spoken from a person in that particular government department publicly. People speak out in very different ways. But what's happening here beyond all of these issues of contenders and areas is that Malaysia is struggling with in a process of political transition to the emergence to a kind of new type of politics, a politics where people talk about solving problems as opposed to solving personalities, a politics where people talk away not just about race, but talk about sense of place and how those places can be transformed. And it's a difficult transition because the politicians aren't making that transition, but the public are. And this is a very interesting type of dynamic that we see happening on the ground. I've taken some time, and I'm happy to share these with you, to look at the manifestos, because I know some of you young people and elderly people and all of us at Young at Heart will be asking ourselves, what's in the manifestos? All right, and I think Bill did a great job of talking about it, what's in it for Sabah. But I also found what was really troubling for myself when I went through manifestos for the different groups is how limited they are. There's still a laundry list. There's no vision for addressing these issues. And you can see, some have more lists than others. On youth, we can see that there are issues of housing, issues of education, issues of political freedoms, which by the way, Per Capita National doesn't have. And I think one of the things to keep in mind that Per Capita National is the most conservative out of all the coalitions and the most ultranationalist in the way that it is articulated. And this comes out in their respective manifestos. Again, for time, I'm not going through this in detail, but I'm happy to share this. We can see in the economy, right? The biggest problem that they're facing. How are people going to talk about inflation and cost of living? There are two different approaches, and this is fascinating discussion, right? BN is talking about a basic income strategy of households, and Harapan is talking about expanding social welfare and dealing with issues associated with pension schemes, a kind of modest reform for a kind of social safety net. Well, Per Capita National solution is to have a one-stop center for aid distribution, like a market store. When you look at these manifestos, you see people who put attention to things and people who didn't. And it's in Per Capita National on these issues of dealing with a social safety net have a great program. The problem is they haven't talked about it at all. There's no meaningful conversation. It was just something they presented at a program and with the hope that it would win support, but it hasn't had traction. And that's one of the big challenges, that these issues on the ground do not have attention that they deserve because they are really substantive. I also pull out the discussion about jobs. And I think here we see some really interesting conversations about protection of workers' rights, opening up and changing vocational education, building on issues of caregiving. So they're actually, again, this is extraordinarily rich conversations and policy initiatives, but again, limited conversations about them in the campaign itself. B40, the poverty issues, I think we can look about, the B40 ironically have supported the BN at the highest level. And that's the only thing they have are free computers in their manifestos in terms of these areas. We can see slightly more in some of the others, but we don't really have a poverty eradication program. We don't have a discussion about how to address some of the problems of social mobility in each of the agendas. So these are some of the realities of what's happening, is that there is this gap between the policy problems and issues. And this is a larger question that people ask is, does the election solve Malaysia's problems? No, it's a reflection of them. Women, again, and there's been a number of colleagues who have raised this in Twitter. I would point you to Yuren, who's done a very good assessment of women's issues, but here we can see some of the initiatives for women. Notice that Per Capita National does not want to give citizenship to mothers that have children overseas. Okay, I've talked a bit about the dynamics on the ground. Some of these are in my articles. I'm trying to keep to time, Bill. I want to briefly now talk about the latest series articles that I have that have come out about projections. And I think it is very difficult to make projections in this election because of a number of factors. First of which is that there's still 15 to 20% undecided voters. At least 40% of those are young people. And so what we see is a situation where if they come out and others, it can really be a bigger swing than people would anticipate. Second of all, polling and trajectories really do not, they do not capture the way younger people or even older people are engaging on elections. They're not going to Ceramah. Some of them are watching them online, but most people are watching and engaging things on their phones. So therefore there's a kind of different way of engaging. One of the reason Perkta National has been so successful is that they spent so much money on advertising and social media. And they're all over the radio and all over these programs, which I think has been one of the reasons why I continuously hear from people, who are you voting for? I'm voting for PN. I said, do you mean BN? No, I mean PN. Are you sure? Siapa yang calon sini? And they will say, oh, and they'll list the PN candidate. So I'm like, in that context. So we see a situation. Now, the undecided, there were 64 seats as of yesterday. And so the blue column refers to seats that I think people can call in different parties. PH has the majority of these. The majority of those are DAP seats, okay, in terms of looking at the composition. We can see that PAS is number 2, PN is number 2, but there are three seats from Bersatu that I have called for Bersatu, in part because they're in PAS areas but Bersatu has been able to be successful. BN is having the most trouble so far in the election. And most of that trouble has been self-inflicted in places like Arau and Padang Serai, Padang Besar in Perlis, in places like Maran and Pahang, and even in places such as Sungai Besar and Kuala Selangor, when you parachute candidates from outside, the local actors aren't very happy. In Tanjung Karang, the division and the killing, political purging of No Omar, it's fascinating. There are very few flags even flying in Tanjung Karang for Barisan Nasional. So we see a very different dynamic. Now this may change, we still, because the BN money is it was supposed to go down. We'll see whether or not it goes down, and the fear that people think that they're being completely marginalized will bring back the base, and they can build on the sympathy vote. But there's a lot of things here. PH doesn't have its numbers. No one has their numbers. We're looking at a hung parliament. GPS and Sarawak will be important. The actors and parties in Sabah will be important, but they won't be as much as a king. They'll probably be princes in that process. The kingmakers probably will be GPS and the different variations. The other thing that's happened in the last day or two is that the coalitions, some of these coalitions may break apart. I think it's interesting to see whether or not PN will stay together, Bersatu or PAS, in that context. And we'll see how that evolves. But what is this? Let me close by saying just a few things here. Number one is that, there's a gap between what the voters want and what the politicians and the parties are providing. And as a consequence, people are choosing the parties that they like, they dislike the least in this contest. There's also a situation where party loyalties and candidate factors are mattering more. So therefore, this contributes to the diversification, the factionalism, whether or not that's in Kedah and in Sabah or other parts of the country. And that what we're seeing is a reflection of the diversity and fragmentations of different dreams of Malaysians in the election itself. And I think that's what we see, one of the reasons why we have a hung parliament in that context. The differences in the Malay community are the ones that are perhaps going to be the most salient in terms, and have already contributed to what we see is happening. But it's not just the Malay community, also socioeconomic lower class voters are changing their vote, as well as young people. And those are the interesting ones to watch. I'll close there. Thank you so much and again, Bill, I apologize if I've gone over time.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Bridget. I don't know though. That's not much of a dream. Vote for the party that you dislike the least. That's but thanks for that. The usual insights, and now it's time to go to questions. We have about 15 or 20 minutes left, so I'll open the floor to anyone who would like to ask questions, pose questions to our speakers. And if you'd like, you can turn your camera on and turn your microphone on and get involved. Well, okay. Let me ask you a quick one. I'll pose a first question to Vilashini, if I can, and it would be this. Terence Gomez spoke to us the other day, and he says that he tells us that Sabah is quite unlike all the other states in the Federation. And naturally, Terence takes a sort of political economy perspective. And what's unique about Sabah, it seems, especially alongside Sarawak, is that there are no tycoons there, unlike every other state within the country. And so when you say that still the importance of money is very high, and indeed Sabahans are notorious, I guess, for doing anything for money. You said too that money politics continues to thrive in the Sabah setting. Can you tell us how it's money politics, just briefly, how is money politics practiced in a different and unique way within the Sabahan setting, when it is the case that there are none of the large warlords, immense amounts of money, no tycoons around which this kind of activity can organize?
Thank you very much for that, Professor Case. So I'd like to sort of use a story when I was on the ground during the Kimanis by-election that sort of happened. When was that, Bridget? Kimanis happened in 2019. Was that it? Yeah, 2019. Moving around the district with friends who were working as election monitors at that time, was that, and later on, I myself became an election monitor for the, what you call state election in 2020, was that one of the things that we were sort of trained to look out for were the gathering of individuals in sundry shops, for example, or in little tuak shops, or should I say local moonshine shops that would serve places. Now, I think the idea in which, you know, things are shadily done and in the dark, and, you know, these little envelopes of money is sort of given is a bit of a stereotype, simply because, as I've sort of mentioned, is that what do you call the handing out of sort of handouts, whether it be cash or in kind, can move in many forms. And in some cases, it could be, like I said, in the form of food, or what do you call food stamps or things like that. I'm very sorry. My cat Cher wants to participate in the conversation. So if you hear her, she's not in pain. She's just incredibly irritated. Anyway, as I was saying, while the presence of tycoons may not exist, what we do have present in Sabah are certainly palm oil estate business owners and people who've gotten very rich on these sort of like non-urban development projects that have been going on for many years. People who've been also sort of involved in consolidating native land titles to sort of the building of palm oil estates, for example, money essentially. And you know, I'm pretty certain Professor Terence Gomez will probably have more to say about this, but my understanding of it is that oftentimes money doesn't move in huge bulk in Sabah. It moves in smaller groups. It moves through smaller businesses by way of going through palm oil estates is a very good example. Areas where there are major fisheries, for example, and a lot of that money that's gathered there essentially help fund a lot of the political movements that are happening, especially in rural areas. So later on, I think apart from moving cash, which has also been not practiced as much, I think, in the recent decades, is essentially the movement of other things that are pretty much in kind. So I hope that sort of answers your question. And if maybe Bridget might want to add to that.
I would say I kind of disagree with Terence. I think there are tycoons in Sabah. I think that they're big families. They're big families, and that can like the Philippine politics, we find big families that control a lot of wealth, elite families in Sabah. And one of those in particular is a godfather, and that's the Musa Aman family, who has his tentacles in almost all the different political parties. I would also say that, we do see quite a few tycoon candidates running in this election. And we see that in particular, for example, for one of the contests in Tawau, which is a very hot contest, and one of the candidates is a man called Lau, the third richest family in Sabah. So I think I think that it's a question of, I would say, I can speak to what Terence says or what the definition of a tycoon is, but to think that there isn't money and that there's a concentration of that money, I think probably doesn't necessarily, he's probably looking at slightly different things, different measures. And I think one of the challenges is that, Sabah has extremely high Gini coefficient compared to the rest of Malaysia because of high inequality, because some of this wealth is extremely concentrated, and because we have some of the highest level concentration of poverty. So I do think that money politics, in a way, there is this inequality and there is this concentration of wealth. But what makes Sabah interesting is that there's much more sharing of the patronage compared to other places, because the politics is more fragmented. And so that is interesting because it trickles down in different ways. So we have a lot of localized, smaller mini warlords that end up for specific areas that are able to use their money politics, and that makes for much more of the fragmentation. And so if we look, for example, there are three contests I'd pull out to you that I think are very interesting in this regard. One is Kota Marudu. We have the PBS president who is running against a KDM. Both are throwing money. It's like Christmas has come early, all right, in that context. And Max is trying to stay, Dr. Max is trying to stay in power while he's being challenged in that area. We have similar dynamics in Kimanis, where different local families are playing off against each other and throwing money in this particular area. And they're hoping that these resources will be able to score them the election. But I think that, money is not just the one thing. It's also what the money represents, the sense of access to patronage, a sense of security that comes with it, the survival types of processes. So just to build a little bit on what Villa was saying.
Can I also add to Bridget that, and I'm very glad you brought up Musa Aman, Bridget, thank you very much, is that one of the infamous things that Musa Aman did also during his tenure was essentially build a very strong network of high-ranking civil servants or ex-civil servants that also sort of helped with the building of networks with not just the civil service, but outside of it. When Warisan took over, a lot of these people, particularly like say in the forestry, is a very good example. They were no longer, they were probably asked to retire early, or they transferred into different offices, really sort of breaking the ties and the networks that I think BN under Musa Aman had built at one point of history. So, with the impending return or the expected return of potentially the BN parties, for example, it's very easy to tap into that. And a lot of these things are, as Bridget said, not necessarily liquid in that sense. They are tied to major assets that are worth probably, if not millions, then billions of ringgit, right? And they can be liquidated anytime. So also, I was a little bit confused or maybe thrown with the statement that there are no tycoons, because there are certainly millionaires and billionaires, right? And they have access to a different kind of wealth that is certainly not conceived or easily conceivable by the everyday Sabahan, the everyday Malaysian. Sometimes I tell people, I don't think you've seen wealth until you've gone to places like Sabah and Sarawak. Some of the wealth or some of the wealthiest people there don't have to flaunt it simply because it's a completely different reality. And these are networks that are very tappable, right? And they will hold a lot of they do come back into the game, into the political game, especially in a time where the general elections are up.
Yeah, if we can keep the focus on the subnational level here for a minute and shift from Sabah to Kedah. Does anyone have a question that we can pose to Prof. Aziz?
Bill, there's also a question in the chat from Wilson. He says the Pakatan Harapan narrative now is voting for the coalition or party instead of candidacy's profile. Will this narrative work, or is it just a perception game?
Let's have Aziz start first.
Yes,
perhaps,
I think so.
yeah, perhaps I can answer to that questions. I think it depends on voters. I don't think it can, it can win heart and mind of voters, all of the voters, because definitely voters actually have different ideas when it comes to voting. In the case of Kedah, like I mentioned to you, some segment of the voters actually prefer to see who's going to be going to win in the constituency, meaning that they vote for candidates, rather than party. But of course, certain segment of society, like for example, like young voters, for example, I think when I talk about youth, so many of the youth actually they don't know the candidates, probably they know certain leaders, certain personalities, but in terms of voting, probably they will go to vote for parties that they like. So, but I think we also need to divide, young voters into two segments. One is I think only 18 voters, meaning that between age 18 to 20, and the rest of young voters, because only 18 voters actually very interesting because their numbers actually very high in Kedah. So about I think about almost 90,000, if I'm not mistaken, of the voters, and they actually have no knowledge about politics, and probably they will depends on their peer groups, and also they will depends on their parents, to decide for them to vote. So if their parents say, okay, you vote for Barisan Nasional, I think they will accept and vote for Barisan Nasional. But I think some segment of the population, probably between age 20, and 21, and also probably 20, 25, or come to 30, they actually follow politics through social media. In fact, they also argue that they got information and knowledge about politics through social media, particularly TikTok. So that's why TikTok is very important platform for political party to engage with the young voter, particularly age 30s below. And that's why I think I can see Bukres, many leaders in Kedah actually they try to use TikTok to persuade people, to support them. But I think it's very difficult to see whether one segment of of the voters will meaning that either a whole segment of voters it will vote for parties or for candidates. Actually they are divided, depending on what's their background, and also what's their inclination towards political party. But I can say that for those hardcore voters, definitely they will vote for parties, but only the undecided voters, they actually will vote according to what that they can see important for them, either parties, candidates, or even influence from their family or peer groups. For example, another example that I can see from Johor's state election, actually the young voter, particularly the vote 18 voters, they vote for Barisan Nasional because I think for the sentiment back then is very strong to Barisan Nasional. But I cannot see that again happen in Kedah for this coming election. I think their vote probably will be divided into different political parties. So that's why I think any party still have a good chance to win votes from the young voters in Kedah.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the chat bar here, and I see that there's a large amount of interest in Borneo politics and how this is going to affect, I guess, the national dynamic. And so here's a question from Wilson. You come in on it as you can. So as Sabah and Sarawak emerge as kingmakers, I guess, will this then create a disparity of power distribution? So will we shift then from a Malaya parliament to a Borneo skewed parliament? So meaning, I guess, that policy weightage and representation are going to shift away from the peninsula and increasingly focus on East Malaysia. So that's a question from Wilson. Anyone like to respond to that?
I'm going to let Bridget go first.
I wanted to say to the other question on the issue of voting for party versus coalition. I think people are starting to more and more turns to coalition, except for in some locations where personality matters. Like, you know, I saw where some localities, but I think, you know, a good example of where candidate coalitions are really being challenged is whether or not you should vote for Warisan in Sabah or whether or not you should vote for PH. And this is really playing out in quite some interesting seats. Now, in terms of the issue of Borneo politics, I think, you know, the real question becomes, are the politics for people, Sarawakians or Sabahans, or is it for the elites of the of Sabah or Sarawakians? You know, right now the negotiations are going to be about with those who are in power. And if the negotiations focus on positions as opposed to policies or outcomes, I do think that the power balance won't change for Sabah and Sarawakans, and it will be more about the influence of individuals and the redistribution of the different actors who get what positions, what projects, what money, what position, you know, access to different company areas. Now, what I have seen, however, is GPS already has a strategy. They've already started to negotiate what they want. And not only the DPM position, but also in terms of some of the policy initiatives of controlling different projects. I think they're coming to the negotiation table with something ready. The Sabahans, not so much yet, and partly because they're fragmented and they're not sure how much they're going to win in this area. Now, I do feel that this question of the balance of power is changing. You know, there's this conversation that Sabah and Sarawak should get 1/3 of the seats in parliament, and this was supposedly promised. This is going to be a radical, very big issue to change. I think it's going to create a lot of conflict within the larger process of Malaysia. It's going to mean, I think the only way it's going to be solved is that if they create the parliament size doubles in this context or in other areas, and this is going to be very problematic. So, you know, I do think there is inevitably going to be power shifts and problems that emerge. But I would also say that, you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing that Borneo starts to get a bit more of the money and resources, especially since they've provided most of it for the country, and because they have problems of high levels of poverty. And I think that perhaps this balancing, not just to Borneo, but to kind of rural and semi-rural areas and small towns, is long overdue.
Adding to what Bridget said is that I also agree. I think Sarawakian politics and the political parties in Sabah, Sarawak, particularly GPS, have always been a lot more vocal about what it is that they want. I think they operate with less hesitancy compared to Sabah, and simply not just because of fragmentation also, but I think personality politics within in-groups are also a huge problem. You know, I think essentially a change in dynamics amongst comrades has been seen as an issue. Warisan is a very good example of that, with the departure of somebody like Peter Anthony from Warisan, and also in places like Penampang, for example, which is where I vote, right? Which is a KDM or a Kadazan stronghold, essentially, where for several years now, many of the voters have gone in really thinking about, you know, combining both the idea that there are liking in representation of Warisan should be voted in. But this particular year, there's a lot of people that feel incredibly conflicted, simply because when they break it down to personality, you know, it's a question of Daryl was a federal minister, and the kind of development that have come to even a place like Penampang or the Greater Kota Kinabalu is greatly lacking and limited. And so, you know, now the question is, do we give it to somebody else? Do we give it to another politician who represents indigenous representation and identity? But does that necessarily correlate to indigenous needs. And so I think these concerns and questions will be ongoing up until the day, I suppose, we cast our votes. So I think this is an area in which where Sabah is also incredibly divided between East and West Coast, right? We have very different identity concerns between people on one side of the coast to the other. On one side with the Suluk Bajau community, and on the other side, the KDM community that are understood to be, more Christian, a different kind of indigenous community from the other side of the coast. So there are a lot of these, I think, identifier and certainly nuances that have to be taken into consideration when it comes to thinking about politics that is happening in Sabah versus Sarawak.
Can I respond to there's a second question regarding hang parliament, whether there is the possibility PH and GPS can form a coalition. This is a question I think from Elijah. So, okay, I think we don't have any experience of hang parliament yet, but we had experience with hang state assembly in the case of Perak and also Kedah in the last general election. So let's see Perak, what happened actually in Perak. Actually, Pakatan Harapan won 29 seats in Perak, and Barisan Nasional won 27 seats. PAS won 3 seats. And what happened is that Barisan Nasional actually called PAS to form coalitions and ask, and also try to meet, Sultan Nazrin, meaning that they plan to form a government. But what Sultan Nazrin did actually ask Pakatan Harapan first, because they got the biggest number, so they need to form a coalition first. So what happened is that Pakatan managed to lure 2 state assemblymen, men and women, there are 2 from Barisan Nasional to defect to Pakatan Harapan. So because of that, they managed to form a government. Similarly, in the case of Kedah, when Pakatan Harapan got 18 seats, PAS got 15, and I think Barisan Nasional got 3. So actually, PAS want to form a government together with Barisan Nasional. The Sultan said no. Actually, I need to give chance to the biggest number, meaning the Pakatan Harapan, to form a government first. So that's why Pakatan Harapan lure 1, member of state assembly from Barisan Nasional to join in, to defect to Pakatan Harapan, and from that, because of that, they managed to form a government. So what happened in the current context? Because we have anti-hopping law, so definitely there's not going to be a single, member of parliament to defect. It must be a party, to defect. It is still allowed by the law. So what happens is that, in order to form government, I think PH need to have the biggest number, in this coming election. With having the biggest number, I think they can persuade Agong to form a government. So Agong will ask them, now you have the biggest number, then you need to form a government. So that's why I think they will see which party that can form together with them. So that's why I think GPS is one of the options. So don't be surprised. Other options as well, like Barisan Nasional and other party like IRS also can also become part of the government. So this also apply if Barisan Nasional also in the lead and also Pakatan Nasional. But the only possibility now we can see that probably Pakatan Harapan in the lead. So that's I think the situation. And I think Anwar Ibrahim, if he's going to be the Prime Minister, this combination, you need to use all his skill to persuade other party to join in to form a single majority government. Okay, that's the one of the options. The second option, I think, proposed by Wong Ching Huat, Professor Wong Ching Huat, saying that it's going to be probably a minority government. So meaning that it's going to be the CSA MOU signing with the opposition party in order to form a government. Okay, this I think for me I'm not really keen towards this idea, the second option, because for me it's still unstable. So meaning that I still believe that majoritarian approach is more likely in this coming election. So probably that's my answer to that question. That's you.
Let me pick up a few things here. I think Aziz is right that whoever will be asked will be the coalition that has the largest number. Now the question is there a relationship between GPS and Pakatan Harapan that is going to be viable? I think a lot of it will depend on what GPS wants and whether or not it's able to be accommodated. And where I slightly differ with Aziz, I think Anwar Ibrahim would be much better if he did not go himself, because he has a lot of baggage and he sent somebody else like his wife to do the negotiating in that process, especially to both Sabah and Sarawak because of his own personal baggage in that area. I think that I would like to point out, if the numbers are indicating what I think they are, and that they're low for both for PN and for Barisan Nasional, and that might, as I said, that might change. But if they're low, then that even the inclusion of GPS probably will not mean a very strong government in terms of overall numbers. And I would also like to point out that if they're low for Barisan Nasional, one has to expect that that party is going to implode. As a result of the implication of the fact that there will be a leadership change in that party, unlike what happened in 2018, where Najib, I think, did the right thing and stepped down as the party president after the defeat. It is my view that Zahid Hamidi may not do that. And I think that we've already seen the differences within that political party play out. And my question is that GPS will have to ask themselves the big question is, which is this going to be the more stable coalition? A BN PAS Bersatu coalition with GPS, or a PH GPS coalition? And I think that, while all the coalitions have problems, I think that the former, a BN PAS Bersatu, which by the way are already fighting, as well as a GPS dynamic, probably has their own sources of political instability. And I think those come from UMNO, because UMNO has been the driver of instability in the politics for the last 4 years, since they haven't dealt with the reforms of their party and haven't changed their leadership. And I think that is something they continue to wrestle with. Now, they may end up doing better than the numbers have indicated so far. But of course, that will also create its own sense of instability, because you see, the problem UMNO faces is that it wants to be dominant in everything. And that has its own set of challenges. So I think GPS has a lot of influence, and they may even have bigger numbers than I projected. Their numbers are 28 seats that they think they can win. I have put down 23 to 24, and I've been a bit more conservative in that regard. So that I think it's all going to come down to the configuration. And also, don't rule out the fact that coalitions may pull apart. You might see a Bersatu go somewhere and a PAS go somewhere else, for example. And that cannot completely be ruled out for Pakatan Harapan either, although I think that's less likely than people try to say that it's going to happen. But I do point this out.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. We are deep into overtime now. Dr. Gaik is kind to give us an additional 15 minutes, but we have
already
nearly used that up as well. So would each of you like to make a 60-second summary statement in which you perhaps rehearse very quickly your major theme? And while you're thinking about that, what's really quite interesting, I think, is that here we are now, just 55 hours away from voting time. And yet still, there's an immense amount of uncertainty over what's likely to happen on Saturday. There's never been an election quite like this, and it's you've underscored that point tonight. And it's so we are haunted with the suspense, and which genuinely tells us too, I think, that look, there's increasing democratic space in this country, and that these elections have grown more uncertain and more competitive. And yet still we seem to be managing this, accommodating it in a peaceful way. And it tells me too that, elections are, if anything, growing even more meaningful in the Malaysian context now. All the more reason, I guess, to work on, for the next government, to work on this agenda of political reform, which is another question, I guess. But would you like to have 60 seconds each just to wrap it up and say goodnight.
I'm just going to follow the order in which I've been thrown into the pit. Of course, I want to thank everybody for this wonderful opportunity, but I think if there's anything, and while it can sound very bleak, uncertainty is actually a really good indicator that things, as you sort of put it, Professor Case, are changing. For a lot of people, I think in Sabah who are still uncertain, or at least a certain degree, has a certain degree of uncertainty, it's because there's no longer the same old herd mentality that used to exist when I was a kid, when it came to politics in Sabah, where it was incredibly readable and incredibly predictable. And I think that lack of predictability is actually in itself a great sign that change can come. It may not be the change that we want immediately, but it's certainly the change that is necessary as a sort of building block. So here's to more uncertainty and critical thinking.
Okay, I think for me, don't be surprised if you, after the general election this coming Saturday, the government still cannot be formed, within a week or more than a week, because if hung parliament is the reality in this election, so meaning that I'm not sure whether it's going to be a constitutional crisis for because of this, but I think this is also good exercise in order to understand the Malaysian politics, how things going on. But for me, another thing that I want to point out is about, I believe that the turnout rate is going to be high this time, because you can feel the atmosphere now, the tension, everything, that people, even the young, will vote in the examination. But the percentage is going to be low, because we have also significant number of automatic voters which won't turn up. Whatever happens, they just simply don't turn up. So I don't think that it's going to be 82% or 83% like previous elections, but it's going to be a very significant high percentage as well, probably 60 to 70% of the turnout voting. But still, I need to encourage everybody to, particularly the young, to come and vote, because it's the best. Make it like a fiesta, for this coming election. It's good for Malaysian democracy. So back to you.
I said earlier, you may not like your choices, but the point is Malaysians now have more power than they ever did before. And this is, and they have been able, and this election, they will be able to wield that power. And I think the candidate and the coalition that is chosen has the highest numbers, will come from more numbers of voters than ever before. And even if it's not something, if these actors do something that people don't like, the implication is they will be kicked out again. And I think because of the power that is happening. But I do think that this process of change it's unsettling. But what we've seen in this campaign so far is that there has been momentum and a rekindling of that sense of empowerment. And I do think that that opens up the opportunity for continued momentum towards change, and it makes Malaysia much stronger.
There's the dream. It's finally come into view. So that's great. Thank you so much, all three of you, and the audience as well. I mean, we had a much greater turnout than initially we had anticipated. This may be a metaphor for the election itself. Turnout may be much greater than we had expected, and that would be encouraging too. So look, let me thank you all very much once again, and I'll return the mic to Dr. Gaik, if I can. And just to close off the evening.
Thank you everybody for sticking with us till late into the night. And I'd like to thank the three speakers for their wonderful insights, very kind of detailed, very detailed look into what's happening actually on the ground. And it's often, we don't get that, being stuck in KL. I just want to say too that we've recorded this, so I'll try to get it out on YouTube. Well, it won't happen until I get I reach Penang tomorrow afternoon, and then I'll get it up. So if any of you know other people who would like to listen to the recording, just to email me at uonari@nottingham.edu.my for the recording. And yes, please vote. Okay, thank you, everybody. Maybe let's give a round of applause to our speakers.
Good night, everybody.
Okay.
Everyone,
Selamat
terima
berundi.
kasih. Selamat berundi. Selamat mengundi. Selamat malam.
Ya, mengundi juga.